So our apologies for the apologies for the mix-up when we started. Matilda had meticulously done it automatically, and then the automatically didn't seem to work. So she had to scramble around at the last minute and put you all in there, and I think she did a great job. Thank you very much, Matilda, for keeping you ahead while we were all going, what's happening? What's happening? So I hope you all had productive chats in your breakout rooms. We're going to give a summary of it now, and this part is being recorded. So the question, if you could receive a summary of the notes, we're going to make the webinar recording, and we can make the summary session recording available. And beyond that, we can talk about at the end when we've heard from each people. So if I could call on some people, I think I saw Natalie there. Natalie was doing the climate justice, am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So Natalie, would you like to tell us what was being discussed in your room?
Yeah, we discussed quite a lot. So we talked about, obviously the intersection. I can give a little bit of background. So our climate justice group, the focus is on climate justice aims to put equity, justice, and human rights at the centre of decision-making and action on climate change and related environmental issues like biodiversity loss and land degradation. So it really recognises that the impacts of climate change are felt differently by right across society. So structural inequities, race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, they're all unevenly distributed because of climate change. So we spoke about a range of things. One, we spoke about the Tuvalu Agreement. And for those of you that don't know, it's a bilateral agreement where Australia will offer up to 280 people from Tuvalu access to permanent residency each year. And that is in the face of climate change and talking about a lot of Pacific Island nations sinking. And we spoke about how this is particularly problematic, given that Pacific Island leaders had been very clear that climate change is the single greatest threat facing the region, and they asked for three things. One was to dramatically increase climate finance, one was to end fossil fuel subsidies, and one was to commit to a fossil fuel Pacific, none of which Australia was able to or delivered on. We spoke about climate change in the context of disaster recovery and how we need to be framing this as a disaster, and how we can support and empower position women in positions of empowerment through disaster recovery, and also some of the gender norms that infused our climate change recovery efforts. So, for example, in the 2004 tsunami in India, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, women were killed at 4 times the rate of men because they weren't taught how to swim or climb trees. We spoke about demilitarization, so the contribution of militarization that not only diverts resources away from climate spending. So Australia and New Zealand military spending could fund the whole region's climate adaptation and mitigation efforts. We spoke about the power of having local voices and place-based voices, and being able to speak in the language of others in an empowering way. We spoke about having a better understanding of what the election cycles over the next 4 years across the region look like. What are the where are climate and gender on the agenda? What sort of influence is required? We spoke about that in Australia specifically, some of the conflicting policies and lack of unity between state and federal governments, and how this can create quite a bit of confusion, and also have misaligned policy. We spoke about conversations needing to be inclusive, and an example were farmers for climate action, and how do we engage broader sects of the community so that nobody feels alienated. We spoke about the fact that women don't need changing, it's systems that need changing, and what sort of systems do we need to change, and also how we, and when I say we, we're talking about Australia in this case, how we change our approach with the Pacific to one that's not interfering with their sovereignty and their approach and their identity. We spoke about the fact that we don't think the government has recognised that we are in a climate crisis or an existential crisis. And if they had, would they be mobilising a COVID-like response? We spoke about movements and grassroots movements and the changing shape of movements over the decades, and how there is opportunity for us to be more coordinated across groups and causes, to make sure that these movements are really clear and deliver the outcomes required. So one of our attendees mentioned, for example, that trying to be across all of the different groups and even activist networks or women's networks, it can be quite confusing, and it would be great to have more coordination and consistency, which I absolutely agree with. We spoke about finance. We need more grassroots finance, particularly for women-led projects. We need accessible finance for women's organisations. We need divestment from fossil fuels. We need microfinance that provides, small amounts of finance to women-led projects. And then lastly, we spoke about the rise in climate litigation, how we're equating climate change now with human rights. So we're seeing a rise in a real wave of climate litigation, particularly led by young people who are suing governments all over the world for their right to a clean, healthy environment. So we went through quite a bit.
Didn't you? I'm thinking, did you only have the same amount of time as us? Really? That's fabulous. Thank you, Natalie. More coordination and consistency. I'm hearing that a lot. Collective action, but how do we do that? Anyway, Chelsea, you were in the economic group. Would you like to tell us what was happening?
Okay, so we covered both care economy and economic independence in the same group. So we spoke about the global redistribution of caregivers. So while we are missing caregivers in Australia, we're trying to attract caregivers from overseas, but it actually results in a redistribution, which then causes the giving country to be losing their own caregivers. So how then could we do this better? Because we're actually disadvantaging the women in those countries that they come from. We also talk about the dependency ratio, where women are having children later, which means that they're now stuck in a two-sector care, carrying down and carrying up because of the time it's taking them to have children. There was also a conversation around the economic dependence of older women. In New Zealand, the retirement income, compulsory retirement savings did not come into much later. In Australia, we had it in the early 90s, and how that's really impacting on the economic well-being of older women in New Zealand. And also post-retirement, where there's a need to use technology to do certain activities, the older women are also being disadvantaged by not being able to adopt or having the right hardware to use those technology. We spoke about the informal caregiving sector and how we would measure that caregiving sector. At an economic theory point of view, informal caregiving cannot form part of the GDP, but there is talk amongst countries to use a time use survey to quantify the value of informal caregiving, and also about the regularity of the time use survey and the parameters around time use survey. And that really goes back to trying to shift the informal caregiving into the more formal care or into paid work. So in Australia, they measure it at $128 billion, which is what is the economic loss to the society by women not participating economically. So maybe across countries, we can start using that kind of numbers to indicate how much we're losing in total. We also talk a bit more about technology, about how technology could solve some of the problems that we are trying to resolve. More importantly, what are the problems that we're trying to solve? So I think overall, working across many platforms, there's no real conversation or appetite from women wanting to use technology to make us economically better. We seem to shy away from that conversation, and technology is still very much dominated by men because women are not speaking that language. And it also leads to financing in this space. So I think if we collectively as a group put our technology lens on, I think we can solve a lot of these problems if we enable ourselves better in terms of technology. Did I miss anything from our economic group?
No doubt there would be something. It's very difficult not to, not to actually miss something, because there's so much rich conversation. So thank you very much for that.
Thanks, Suzanne.
And I might follow on from that, Chelsea, before handing over to Kerry. So we were doing the women's health, and it was just, the care economy came up in our group too, as how it impacts on health, because particularly the informal care sector means that women put the care of others before their own health. So we were looking at how that influenced women's health in general, and it needed to be recognised. But obviously, this is where our systems approach comes, because the answer is not through the health system, it's through the economic system and through the value system of society. So there are different ways of approaching the same thing. We talked about taking a life cycle approach to women's health, and particularly women's reproductive health. There seems to be a focus on those mid-range years of childbearing and reproductive years, but it also means that that it's not recognised always the particular needs. So if you're a younger person, you're not given priority in some areas. If you're an older person, you're not given a priority in some areas. So it's like, let's actually take everybody where they're at, instead of putting this assumption on it because of your age. We talked a lot about the need for, with Pacific health services, to have ethnic specific services. There is so much value in having Pacific services in general is a good starting point. Pacific ethnic specific services is even better, because then you've got people speaking the language, then you've got the people being able to explain to you, then you've got everything that works better. So in our advocacy, we're talking about the need not just for specific ethnic groups to be advocating for services for themselves, but everybody to be advocating for those sort of services to be set up. We were talking about funding too, about not just throwing more money at the situation. It's about where is that money going? And it's about also working smarter and not harder, because sometimes it's not a funding issue, it's an education issue. So there might be systems in place to provide particular funding or particular procedures or whatever it is. But if there's a gatekeeper who doesn't recognise that, and like in the medical profession, if there are the gatekeepers that need to provide access to a particular pathway, then those are the people who need to be educated to look past age, to look past ethnicity and go, who is this person in front of me and what is best for them, rather than just make these assumptions that we see so often. Listening to the people who need the support and working in that partnership approach yet again is talked about it. So you've got the people from community who know their community, working with the medical profession with policy people to say what's best. So again, we get past assumptions and we get to reality, what is actually happening, which is data. Again, it's so often I've heard today, data. You need the data to show that there is a problem, or the policy people don't agree that there's a problem. And numbers mean funding and resourcing for the actual programs. Collective action came up a number of times. That coordinated approach that I was hearing, coordinated and consistency, it is so difficult, needs so much resourcing to get there. And advocacy, one of the things about the ethnic specific services, we were looking at how much advocacy is required in our health systems in New Zealand and Australia. We're going, it shouldn't have to be self-advocacy, because that just leaves vulnerable a whole group of people. And this is, again, why ethnic specific services can help, because the advocacy is built into that. And that's probably enough for me at the moment. I will hand over to Kerry. And Kerry was doing violence against women. Oh, yeah, we've stated this too.
Hello. Yes, I wasn't actually doing violence. I was facilitating the group. However, we had a really good discussion actually. There were a nice range of diversity of people who could bring different view and different sort of strength to that discussion. Really nice. There was a lot of talk about the different intersectionalities of causes and repression of violence in the room. We talked about how obviously cultures are different, how responses are different. The causes include things like technology. Sometimes it's interpretation of the Bible in a way which to support violence or subjugation of women. We had a really good chat about that. A lot of the things that some of you are already saying, which is about listening to the different communities and what works for them or what doesn't work for them in terms of addressing this problem. We talked a little bit about the different aspects of the way we try to address violence, like the current sort of do better at addressing both technology and the way that it opens the door to violence and stalking and poor behavior towards women, but which leads to more misogyny, which leads to the things about the manosphere, which Stephanie was talking about and others were talking about earlier. We talked a bit about the justice system and how it's not well positioned to address some of these things in a criminal way. So we need to learn from some of our neighbors about how we can use our justice system better to address violence and to make it more of a preventative or deterrent or punitive way of addressing violence. But we did also touch on the fact that it can't all be about reaction and it can't all be about responses. It has to be about prevention. And so how can we enable and encourage technology organizations or companies that are independent to actually behave in a good citizen way to prevent these things from happening in their backyard or on using their tools and devices. But we also talked a bit about how things like homelessness, women's economics, there's different intersections that feed into violence against women. There's also the work that's being done about men and how you help users of violence or perpetrators of violence not to be perpetrators of violence. So in the prevention space, if we're only interacting in a kind of reactive or response way, we're not solving the problem. We'll never solve the problem that way. We have to work towards prevention. We have to work towards education. We have to work towards, I think we didn't really touch on this, but I think there's an implied thing here about how if we are teaching young people boys and young men to behave well, and what does violence look like, and what is good behavior, what is bad behavior. We talked a little bit about the consent education controversy, taking consent education out of schools, etc. But those things acting in a way that feeds into prevention as opposed to just simply putting a band-aid on the problem. And I think lastly, sorry, we also talked a lot about data. Like, data is so important to being able to evidence the problem and point towards the solutions. And in fact, Kapatu from Cook Islands was talking a lot about how while they have access to data, they don't feel like they have access to the full data, and so they don't have a full picture of actually what are the causes, and so how can they respond to that situation in a really informed way if they don't know the information in depth and understand some of the nuance of that a bit more. But just generally, that data, if we're not collecting data and we're not doing anything with the data we collect, then we won't be able to fix this problem, because we'll just be working in speculation, etc. But it's important that we're collecting data from the different cultures and the different communities and the different peoples that have different experiences. We can't just homogenize that information in one law. But lastly, we talked a little bit about collaboration and how being able to collaborate across organizations for women and groups in this space, sharing that information, not reinventing the wheel, not duplicating efforts. How can we do better and making progress faster if we're collaborating more closely? Anybody wants to remind me of something I forgot to say, please do.
You can always put it in the chat too. There is a chat there that we can download. I'm in awe of the discussions that have been going on. I'm hearing a lot of the need for collective and coordinated action, which is part of what we were trying to do something towards with this meeting today. I'm hearing a lot about the all genders need to be involved in this. This is not a woman-only thing. It is not a particular group in society. Actually, everybody has to be involved, all of us. Systems approach, not just, yes, okay, there might be small bits here and there, but it has to be everywhere, not just one thing. We need to prevent as well as respond. The data comes out all the time. It's the way we measure what we treasure. We have to decide what it is that gets measured and make sure that we have access to that and that it gets used. It's got to be alongside education. It's got to be alongside workforce development. It's got to be along looking after individuals. And the intersectionality keeps coming out all over and over again. And I think particularly in the Pacific, that it has been brought out that the individuality of Pacific nations, Pacific peoples, has to be recognised, maybe more in policy than it is at the moment. And number one, listening to the voices of women. We actually need to collect those voices and make them available. So this is my summary. I'd invite Chelsea to make some comments, and we might, I'm not sure, we haven't quite talked about what's next, but I'm not sure if we can really even get to that right now, but Chelsea, I think.
Okay, just a bit of background. So for those of you who do not know me, I'm the Australian president for the National Council of Women. Suzanne and I met over different platforms over the last 2 years, and probably about 8-9 months ago, we decided that we really wanted to get the women from New Zealand, Australia, and all the way down to all the different Pacific Islands together, because there's no common feed for us at all to be able to connect and work together as a group. And I think that has always been probably one of my concerns as a member of the International Council of Women. So in the olden days, a lot of the Pacific Island women were part of the International Council of Women, and there was a lot more collaboration. Since I became a board member of the ICW, I've noticed that there's this part of our world is very much neglected by the Northern Hemisphere. And Suzanne and I wanted to create an opportunity to bring all of us together. So that was how this started to begin with. And I think from what I'm hearing today, and also from some of the other work that I'm doing, the data collection piece is obviously a really vital piece of information that we need to improve what we do. And gender desegregated data was very much a talking piece in W20 up to 5 years ago. So this is now sort of flowing through into our language. Cross-cutting is another word they use a lot in the advocacy piece. So I'm thinking, and Suzanne and I will probably put our heads together, I'm thinking that once we get through, so the W20 group is meeting in October, and as part of that conversation, they are defining what kind of data we want to collect out of those 20 countries. And I'll be really keen to see how we can fit into that, how we can fit into the same parameters, because I really want to be able to measure how we're doing here versus everywhere else. So I like to be able to do that, and maybe Suzanne and I can work through how we can disseminate the information, how we can keep this group going. We did not get hold of as many National Council of Women in the Pacific region as we would, but I think some of you in the room must already have those connections. So it's really about creating a broader group, more voices, more diversity in the discussions that we have. I think that's the only way we're going to be able to hear what's really happening in our sister islands.
Is it about reaching out? One thing in reflection on this this meeting today is it's one thing to have an idea and to actually, it's easy to do a date and say, here it is. But it's a lot harder to actually develop the relationships. And so another thing I think going forward, it's interesting, Chelsea, if you're talking about, you know, that after October, I think we would really like to connect with other people in smaller conversations to start building up those relationships so that when we come together, it is a bit more familiar for us. I'm loving seeing you. I can see you now, Vane, on my is it Vane or is it Vane? On my screen. It is lovely to have to actually see the person that we've been emailing. For example, I would love to for us to have some extended chats that you can't have on this big group.
And I think one of the feedback that Stephanie gave us when we were trying to organize today's event is that a lot of our sisters on the island nations do not have internet on the weekend. The only internet access was actually at work during the week. And we were trying to make it happen. So we thought that Saturday morning was going to be a good time. So now we've learned something out of that conversation with Stephanie, that we need to be, for us to be inclusive, we also need to understand the barriers for our other members to be able to join us in this forum.
So we will talk about what resources from this, when we get recordings and things made available, we will send it out to everybody who registered. Links, we've just got to sort ourselves out, and you know, as volunteers, it might take a little while, but it will come. And we are almost about our time, and I will finish with the karakia soon, but I just want to open the floor if anybody does want to say something, either unmic and say it, or put it in the chat. And yeah, I agree. Yes,
This is great. This is great stuff. Let's keep moving and move. Let's stay connected, and let's it's about that collective gathering. And unless we know about you, and unless you know about us, we won't be able to help each other. But it's a great start. Yeah, let's move on.
Thank you.
May I just add, Ms. Anderson and also our chair from Suzanne from New Zealand. You know, for a long time, most of the National Council of Women in the Pacific struggle with the institutional strengthening, having dedicated staff. And so most of the National Council of Women are actually run by volunteers, but we do have them. We have them, meaning they can be active working in the labor force, but are presidents or in the committees of those women's councils, like we have here in FSM and Solomon Islands, Fiji. Eventually, it got deregistered, like most of the other civil societies in Fiji, at a certain time with the previous administration. But there are, the short answer is that we can find their context and share that with you both, and really appreciate this using this platform to link up with them. I saw Nolene posted, and I'm very keen to join. I just didn't have enough time to send it out to everybody, given the workload at the office as well. So this week, but there are contacts around the Pacific, and some have offices, some are run by volunteers. Yeah, majority are run by volunteers, really.
For that, that's fabulous to hear, and thank you so much for making time to come. I think it also shows, I mean, like the New Zealand Council is also volunteers, but and so is the Australian Council, as far as I can see. But it makes a big difference as to what environment you are in, as to how much time and resources that you have to put into this. And I know it's different in different places. So to be a volunteer here in New Zealand is often less of a problem than to be a volunteer in some other places. So I hear you about that, and do apologise that it took us so long to get the info out. But again, if this is a starting point, then your offer to keep us and put us in contact is great. If we carry on working like this, then maybe in a year's time or less, that we might be able to do a different sort of thing. I'm not quite sure what it would be like. Okay. Yes. It is 3:48. Unless anybody else wants to say something, I will close us.
And thank you everybody for giving up your Saturday, because it is a big chunk of time. And this is our experiment. And I think we all had a really productive Saturday. So, but more importantly, without all of you joining us today, this would not have been possible. So thank you very, very much.
Malo, just to add, there would have been more Tongans, but tomorrow is Tongan Father's Day. So that's where they're all preparing things for the husband, so for the father. So that's why, yeah.
Okay.
So they get 2 Father's Day, one Australia and one New Zealand and one Tonga. Okay.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will say a karakia to just finish this off.
Yes.
Whakairia te tapu, kia waitia ai te ara, kia turu ki whakataha ai, kia turu ki whakataha ai, huie tai ki.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.